Welcome. You're listening to Dupee Deep with Dr. Nikki. This is the place where witty, irreverent, opinionated perspective meets serious, fact-based discussion. Featuring our host, Dr. Nikki Coleman, and her co-host, Tomas Bell. You can also join in the discussion during our live tapings by following us on Spreaker.com. Now, the doctor is in. It's time to get Dupee Deep.
Hello, 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 and welcome back, Dupee Deep listeners. Welcome back, Tomas. Are you here? You're ready to get into it?
Well, as ready as I'll be with this topic.
Okay, so we're just gonna dive in with this. So we started back recording episodes last month in January, and 2 days before we were scheduled to record, the Jussie Smollett, I still always feel like I'm pronouncing his name incorrectly. I don't know. It's an odd last name. Incident.
Don't worry about it. He knows his name, and so do those Nigerians know it too. So don't you worry about it.
Hope he knows his name.
Right.
Seriously though, the whole news cycle started around this purported hate crime that had happened in Chicago. And so because of the events, we did a podcast about it because that's right in line with many of the topics that we try to cover here at Dupee Deep. And it seemed like a really rich conversation to be had. But prior to us releasing it, Tomas at some point said, you know what, like maybe later that afternoon or evening, or maybe even the next morning, Tomas was like, you know what, let's just hold off and see where this goes. Now, to his credit and to his credit for his critical eye, but also to our credit, you know, what we do here at Dupee Deep is we never just take a surface approach at anything. And so our conversation had evolved to one to think about how it is that we have these bigger systemic sort of socio-political issues that get distilled down to the pop culture level. So we had talked about violence as a tool of oppression. We talked about racism. We talked about homophobia, heterosexism. We talked about hate crime. We talked about all of those things in the show. And towards the end, part of the conversation started to shift to what I think could be easily kind of labeled as tribalism, right? And I think Tomas's comments were around why, how can we move towards a more humanistic conversation such that crimes against individuals are seen as egregious, regardless of what particular social political group a person belongs to, right? So how can we move to a place of having collective outrage about violence against human beings, period, right?
Right.
And my position was and is, yes, I think that that's ideal. I think that's optimal. I hope that we are, as a collective human experience, moving towards that. And at the same time, we cannot ignore the fact that violence, it has been and is continued to be used as a tool to reinforce social systems of oppression and dominance. So I think we can have a both and conversation. So I think that's kind of how we ended the podcast. And then all of the yada, to quote my godmother, all of the yada came out about the case, and things got increasingly more complicated as time went on in this whole situation and scenario with Jussie Smollett. So what we'd like to do is talk a little bit more from the context that we have, play the original podcast in its entirety for you, and then we're going to also come back with a little bit of updated post podcast commentary and reflection. So, Tomas, where are you? What do you want to say?
What a wonderful way to start off Women's History Month, right? Right. Yeah. So.
Which we will get to for sure. I have something exciting planned for talking for I'm gonna do like a little Black woman situation thing that I'm very excited about upcoming. Because it's always intersectional here. Let's be clear.
If it ain't intersectional, it ain't Dupee Deep.
It ain't Dupee Deep. But before we like jump back into the whole rebroadcast or the broadcast of the original podcast that we held back, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what was that gut kind of hesitation you had, or what was the thing that made you say, something ain't right? Because let me say this. In the original podcast, I don't think that we took an explicit "we stand with Jussie" sort of frame, though we did offer our sympathies toward him, because at the time it seemed like something bad had happened to him, and so we were, of course, sympathetic to that. Given my view on things now, I do think something is happening with him. I think we're seeing a very public sort of devolution of some mental health concerns. And so I do still have deep sympathies and regard for him. And I really do hope that I hope that this whole situation resolves in a way for his betterment. Whatever that is, whatever the truth is that we may or may not ever find out, I hope that he is genuinely okay, or even better than okay, improved throughout this entire process. So though we weren't like hashtag stand for Jussie. We did say hashtag justice for Jussie. We try to take as skeptical of a lens as possible. I think I was probably more towards believing him at the time than you were, Tomas. Although I also had some red flags too.
Right.
So
you did.
Why don't you talk a little bit about what your red flags, hesitations, moments were?
Well, I think that you hit the nail on the head when you said something ain't right. There's always that, I call it the black mama voice, having that good Southern black mother and grandmother. Baby, something ain't right. Something ain't right about that, right? So, and the reality is we still don't know what is right and what is wrong because, without condemning anyone, the Chicago PD does have a pretty notorious history of egregious civil rights violations and so forth, which, it is what it is. History is what it is. So I try to take I don't want to say middle of the road or moderate approach. And well, it is a moderate approach, I will say, and not a non-committal approach. But I believe it's easy to be angry and more challenging to be elevated. And so when I looked at this, I said, while it is horrible what happened to Jussie, this is a reflection of something systemic in a larger conversation that we should have. Now, if it were true that people were running around and doing this and screaming, it's MAGA country, it just seemed very emboldened and very, very brash. But my own personal experience has never encountered that. So it gave me pause. I understand racism, both, explicit and implicit, or what some people call that Southern style racism versus that Northern style racism, right? Some is really overt. Right. It's all racism in the end. But the subtle differences between implicit bias versus outright racism. Mm-hmm. If this was true and if it happened, again, we reached new territory. And I still keep an open mind that it could be happening somewhere, and maybe the person just doesn't have the notoriety of a Jussie, so we don't know about it. Could very much be happening, right? So I wanted to
So I think...
Go ahead.
Let me just say, I think we talked about this in the original podcast. My memory is not what it used to be, people.
It was a whole month ago.
It really was. But, we have some very recent horrible incidents where that is a very legitimate thing, like the MAGA bomber. He is literally known as the MAGA bomber.
That's
He's
right.
a Messiah. Yeah,
that's right.
I remember I was like, am I saying anything right? We have Dylan Roof, who sat in the church and worshiped with these people, or at least pretended to worship with these people,
right,
in South Carolina before he shot up the church.
That's right.
We had Charlottesville riots very recently. We had Robert Bowers, who shot up the Tree of Life Synagogue. And as far as I know, the story still stands that he tried to go to a black church first, right? I'm sorry, am I mixing stories?
I think that one.
Is this was the guy that killed people in the Kroger parking lot? Because they both happened in the same week.
You know what?
So it was a white supremacist that killed 2 black people in the Kroger parking lot. And I can't remember which one tried to go to a black church first.
I do not remember the exact facts of either one of those, but one of them did. And I think it may have been the Kroger one, but I'm not sure. So don't quote me on that.
So just the fact that so many of these incidents have happened that we can't distinguish all the details between them. And they all have sort of the same racist, oppressive, xenophobic sort of roots.
Right.
I think, so if you stand on the side that at least some part of Jussie Smollett's story is fabricated, at least some part. He optimized some legitimate, real experiences that are happening in our current culture.
Right.
So it's not, again, we're grateful this has never happened to you, right? For a fact, one of the incidents in which I was called a nigger happened
Absolutely.
in upstate New York, right?
Absolutely.
Early on in our friendship.
Well, but in part, that was in part because you were driving while black. So we have to be real honest about the circumstances surrounding that. You shouldn't be driving while black. Right.
And got called a quote dumbass nigger bitch.
Right. Look at that.
So
he hit checked all the boxes. Intersectional racisms.
All of them. He got
Look
all
at
of
that.
them,
Right.
Happened in New York, and I also still vividly recall being a small child, and the first time I got called a nigger was walking in the suburbs of Sacramento, California with some cousins. And we were literally walking down the street, minding our business. And some white guys in a truck, ironically in a truck, yelled down the windows, "Get out of here, niggers!" And I was really confused. That was the first time I had heard that word. And my older cousins got upset and angry. And I was like, what is happening? And that was the first time I got a lesson in what that word was. To be clear, I'm from Baton Rouge, Louisiana. You don't get much more Southern than that.
Right, right.
So, whether it is verbal violence or physical violence or actual murder and maiming, violence is a tool of oppression. So the circumstances that Jussie Smollett presented are not that far-fetched. To me, it was the details about it where things started to kind of
It wasn't even
unravel.
the details for me. It wasn't the details. And you live in a major city, but it's more spread out than a city like sprawling. We would use that word, right?
Yes.
So New York is also quite large, but New York is small in its largeness, and New York is closer to Chicago in city style than would be to Houston. So here was I don't want to call it a red flag, because again, I'm not here to invalidate someone's experience. I don't take that hard line. What I do is I look at things and I decide for myself what works for me, and then make a decision in that way. So with that being explained, when a person says that something like that happened outside of a Subway sandwich at 2 a.m. in the morning in a certain part of town that I know, because I've been in Chicago, has residential, commercial, which means police have cameras up, which is why I live in a gentrified neighborhood. There are cameras on my corner at the bus stop. There are cameras going in and out of the park. I know that from walking from the train to, my local coffee shop, if something happens, there will be cameras.